I learned a long time ago that people don't panic when the truth disappears. They panic when the water does. The old diesel pump gave one final steady rumble beneath the tin roof before I reached over and flipped the heavy steel switch to off. The familiar vibration faded through the concrete floor until the only sound left was the soft whistle of the Texas wind moving across 87 acres of dry summer grass. A faint smell of warm engine oil mixed with damp limestone drifted through the pump house as silence settled around me. I checked my watch. 7:32 on a bright Tuesday morning. Scheduled maintenance, exactly as listed in the county records, exactly as required by law, exactly as I'd done every year since my father handed me the keys to this ranch. I locked the pump house door, slid the brass key into my pocket, and started walking toward the barn without the slightest idea that less than 20 minutes later someone would dial 911 because an entire suburban neighborhood believed I had sabotaged their lives. My name is Ethan Walker, and everything that happened that day started nearly 70 years before I was born, when my grandfather drilled a deep limestone well with borrowed equipment and enough stubborn determination to outlast every drought Texas could throw at him. My family never struck oil. We struck water, and around here that was worth just as much. My grandfather used to say that fences marked where land ended, but water decided whether that land stayed alive. My father believed the same thing. Every pipe buried beneath this ranch, every pressure gauge mounted to an old cedar post, every weathered valve painted bright red existed because somebody in my family believed preparation always beat panic. I grew up learning the difference between a leaking gasket and a failing pressure regulator before I learned algebra. While other kids spent Saturdays watching cartoons, I followed Dad across the pasture carrying heavy pipe wrenches that felt bigger than my arms. He'd tap the steel lines with his knuckles, listen for changes in the echo, then smile like the ranch itself was talking back. Those sounds became part of my childhood. The steady hum of pumps, the hiss of pressure equalizing through old valves, the distant splash from the stone reservoir tucked behind a grove of live oaks. They were as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. By the time I inherited the property, I knew every inch of that water system better than most people knew their own homes. What I didn't know was that somewhere beyond my northern fence line, a brand new subdivision called Silver Creek Estates had quietly built its perfect streets, identical mailboxes, spotless sidewalks, and expensive homes around something nobody bothered to mention at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Every sprinkler, every kitchen faucet, every garden hose on one entire street depended on water that began its journey beneath my ranch. Nobody ever knocked on my door to explain it. Nobody asked permission. Nobody even introduced themselves. They simply acted like the water had always belonged to them. And that worked perfectly, right up until the morning I followed my maintenance schedule like I always had. By 8 o'clock my phone had not rung once, and that told me everything I needed to know. The people who truly understood where their water came from were not worried because they had already received the maintenance notice I mailed 2 weeks earlier. My nearest neighbors on the ranch road had filled their storage tanks the day before, just like they always did. Old Mr. Collins even waved as he drove past my mailbox that morning, his dusty pickup leaving a ribbon of gravel behind it. He had lived beside us for 30 years and knew that every summer I shut the pumps down for one day to inspect bearings, replace worn seals, and flush sediment out of the main pressure lines. Preventive maintenance was never exciting, but neither was replacing a collapsed water system in the middle of August. The steel pressure gauge mounted beside the pump house slowly drifted toward zero, exactly as it should. I wiped a layer of fine dust off the glass with my thumb and smiled. My father always insisted that gauges told the truth even when people refused to. The smell of cedar posts warming under the Texas sun mixed with fresh cut hay drifting across the pasture, while a pair of red-tailed hawks circled lazily overhead. It felt like every other maintenance day I had ever worked, peaceful, predictable, and honest. Around 9 o'clock, my quiet morning changed. A distant chorus of car horns floated across the fields from somewhere beyond the northern tree line, where Silver Creek Estates sat behind its decorative stone entrance and perfectly trimmed lawns. A few minutes later, I heard the faint wail of emergency sirens, barely noticeable against the steady breeze. I looked toward the subdivision, but could not see much beyond rooftops shimmering in the summer heat. I figured somebody had a plumbing leak, or maybe a contractor had hit a utility line. It was unfortunate, but it had nothing to do with me. At least that was what I believed until my cell phone buzzed. The screen showed an unfamiliar county number. I answered with greasy hands, still holding a wrench. The woman on the other end sounded rushed but polite. She asked whether my ranch water system was currently offline for scheduled maintenance. I told her yes, exactly as permitted, and even gave her the maintenance permit number from memory. There was a long silence before she quietly thanked me and ended the call without another question. That silence bothered me more than the conversation itself. Something did not fit. I walked back toward the old equipment shed where shelves held decades of carefully labeled binders. Every inspection report, every replacement part, every survey map, and every maintenance log my father ever kept sat exactly where he left them. He believed paperwork deserved the same respect as fence posts because both protected what belonged to you. As I pulled one thick binder onto the wooden workbench, a gust of warm air flipped several pages by itself until it stopped on a faded county utility diagram that I had not looked at in years. My eyes settled on a blue line stretching north beyond my property. And for the first time that morning, I felt the quiet certainty that somebody else's expensive secret was finally beginning to unravel. The faded blueprint smelled like old paper, machine oil, and the cedar shells where my father had stored it for decades. Thin blue lines crossed the page with neat handwritten notes in the margin, every measurement carefully checked, every valve numbered in his unmistakable block lettering. Then I saw it. One pipeline left the main reservoir, crossed the northern pasture, passed through a recorded utility easement, and continued beyond my fence toward land that had once been nothing more than open grazing fields. Today those same fields held Silver Creek estates. I felt my stomach tighten, not because the drawing surprised me, but because I suddenly understood why the woman from the county had gone so quiet. My father had always taught me that maps never lied. People did. I carried the binder into the farmhouse where sunlight spilled across the old oak kitchen table. Another binder sat beside the coffee maker, this one filled with photographs dating back almost 20 years. I flipped through page after page until I found aerial images taken before the subdivision existed. Back then, the entire northern section was empty pasture. No houses, no sidewalks, no decorative entrance signs. Just mesquite trees, barbed wire fences, and the same water line that still crossed my property today. The developer who bought that land years later had never built an independent water source. Instead, they connected to the existing ranch supply through an agreement that was supposed to be temporary while permanent infrastructure was being completed. Temporary. That single word suddenly carried a lot more weight than it had the day my father first explained it to me. The permanent system had apparently never been built. Instead, every new phase of construction simply added another connection to the same aging pipeline beneath my ranch. The quiet hum of my refrigerator filled the kitchen while I continued turning pages. Inspection reports, maintenance invoices, replacement pump receipts. Everything had been documented with almost obsessive precision. Dad used to joke that paper weighed less than lawsuits. I smiled for half a second before another document erased it. It was a letter from nearly 8 years earlier addressed to the subdivision developer. My father had warned them that increasing demand without upgrading the system would eventually create serious maintenance issues. The response attached behind it was short and polite. They acknowledged receiving his recommendation and promised improvements during future expansion. There was never another letter. They simply kept building homes. A sharp knock interrupted my thoughts. Through the front window, I saw a white luxury sport utility vehicle stopping beside my mailbox in a cloud of pale gravel dust. A woman stepped out wearing perfectly pressed business clothes despite the Texas heat. Even from 50 yards away, she carried herself like somebody accustomed to giving instructions instead of asking questions. She glanced toward the pump house before looking directly at my front porch. I recognized her immediately from community newsletters that occasionally found their way into my mailbox by mistake. Victoria Hayes, president of the Silver Creek Homeowners Association. She adjusted her sunglasses, folded her arms, and waited with the patient confidence of someone who believed every conversation would end in her favor. She had no idea that while she drove over expecting to discuss a neighborhood inconvenience, I had just uncovered years of forgotten paperwork explaining exactly why her entire street depended on land she did not own. Victoria did not wait for an invitation before walking toward my porch. The sharp rhythm of her heels echoed across the old wooden steps while the summer wind carried the scent of freshly cut hay between us. She removed her sunglasses with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Walker, I assume this interruption will be over within the hour," she said, as though we were discussing a delayed lawn service instead of a private water system sitting on my family's property. I calmly explained that the maintenance would take the rest of the day, exactly as every scheduled inspection had for years. Her expression tightened. "That is unacceptable," she replied. 300 families are without water." I looked at her for a moment before answering with the only honest response I had. 300 families should probably be speaking with whoever provides their water service. She let out a quiet laugh that sounded more impatient than amused. "That would be you." I shook my head. "No, ma'am. I own a ranch. I maintain my ranch. I do not operate a public utility." For the first time since stepping out of her vehicle, she seemed uncertain. It lasted only a second before confidence returned. She pulled several folded papers from a leather folder and held them toward me. They were copies of subdivision maps, landscaping schedules, and homeowners association policies. Colorful diagrams showed flower beds, walking trails, and decorative ponds, but not a single page established ownership of the pipeline beneath my pasture. She pointed to one highlighted section and declared that the neighborhood depended on continuous water access. I quietly asked where the document said my family had surrendered ownership of the well, the pumps, or the distribution line. She flipped through the pages without answering. The silence stretched long enough for a mockingbird perched on the fence to fill it with cheerful song. Finally, she lowered the papers and changed her approach. She insisted that the community had been using the system for years, which in her opinion made it effectively theirs. I had heard arguments like that before. My father used to smile whenever someone confused long-term convenience with legal ownership. He always said that borrowing something for years never transferred the title. The warm breeze rustled the faded county map, still lying on my kitchen table behind me. I could almost hear my father's voice reminding me to let documents do the talking instead of emotions. Victoria stepped closer and lowered her voice. She explained that residents were becoming frustrated, emergency services had been contacted, and local officials would expect immediate cooperation. Her words were carefully chosen, polite on the surface, but carrying the unmistakable weight of pressure underneath. I simply told her the inspection would finish when it was safe to restart the system. Nothing more, nothing less. She stared at me for another long moment before putting her sunglasses back on. "You are making a very expensive mistake," she said. I watched her return to the white sport utility vehicle, gravel crunching beneath her shoes, and drive back towards Silver Creek Estates in a cloud of pale dust. Only after the sound of her engine disappeared did I unfold the original county utility diagram once again. There, beside the blue pipeline crossing my northern pasture, was a handwritten notation that my father had circled decades earlier in bright red ink, a note I had somehow overlooked until that very afternoon. And the more I read those few words, the more I realized that Victoria had just threatened the one person who actually possessed every legal document needed to answer the question she thought had already been settled. The note in my father's handwriting was only one sentence long, but it carried more weight than every confident word Victoria had spoken on my front porch. It identified the northern pipeline as a temporary service connection maintained entirely at the discretion of the ranch owner until an independent municipal system became operational. Temporary. Maintained entirely at the discretion of the ranch owner. I read those words 3 more times before carefully placing the document back into its protective sleeve. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained sharp, as if my father had known someone would eventually need to read it on a day exactly like this. Before I could organize the rest of the files, another vehicle rolled slowly through my front gate. This one wore the county utility district logo on the door instead of polished chrome. The driver stepped out carrying a clipboard, removed his hat, and introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a field inspector. Unlike Victoria, he did not begin with demands. He simply asked if he could confirm that my maintenance work was proceeding according to schedule. I nodded and invited him into the pump house. The air inside still carried the familiar scent of warm metal, lubricating grease, and damp limestone. I showed him the shutoff switch, the maintenance checklist, the replacement seals waiting on the workbench, and the pressure gauges resting at 0 exactly as expected. He quietly examined everything. before making several notes on his clipboard. Then his eyes settled on the framed county permit hanging beside the entrance. He leaned closer, read every line, and slowly exhaled. "This permit has been renewed every year," he said, without interruption. I told him my father started the renewal process decades ago, and I had continued it after inheriting the ranch. Daniel asked one more question that immediately caught my attention. "Has anyone from the subdivision ever participated in maintaining this equipment?" I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the answer. "Not once," I replied. "Every inspection, every repair, every replacement part has been paid for by my family." He looked around the aging pump house again, running his fingers lightly across one of the heavy steel pipes. The paint had faded after years beneath the Texas heat, yet every connection remained solid because someone had cared enough to maintain it. Daniel quietly shook his head and wrote another note. Outside, the distant sound of traffic from Silver Creek Estates had grown noticeably louder. Even from half a mile away, I could hear impatient car doors closing, engines idling, and scattered voices carried across the open fields by the afternoon wind. Whatever was happening inside the subdivision, it was becoming larger than a simple inconvenience. As Daniel prepared to leave, he paused beside his truck and looked back toward the ranch. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "I think there are people operating under assumptions that have never actually been verified." After he drove away, I stood alone beside the old red valve that controlled the entire system. Sunlight reflected off its worn steel handle, while the silent pressure gauge remained fixed at 0. My father had painted that valve bright red, so nobody could ever claim they failed to notice where control truly began. Looking at it now, I realized it had never just been another piece of equipment. It had been quietly telling the same story for decades, waiting for the day someone finally decided to listen instead of assume. Daniel's visit stayed on my mind long after his truck disappeared beyond the cattle guard. He had not accused anyone of doing anything wrong, but he had asked the kind of careful questions that only appeared when somebody finally started looking beneath the surface. I carried another stack of binders into the farmhouse and spread them across the kitchen table beside the original survey maps. The old ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, pushing warm air that smelled faintly of coffee, dust, and aged paper. Every folder represented another year of my family's responsibility. Pump inspections, electrical upgrades, water quality reports, emergency repairs after winter freezes, receipts for replacement motors. Every dollar spent had come from our ranch account. Not one invoice had ever been forwarded to Silver Creek Estates. Not one reimbursement check had ever arrived. I found an aging maintenance ledger that my father had kept entirely by hand. Each page listed dates, weather conditions, pressure readings, and comments written in blue ink. Near the bottom of one entry from nearly a decade earlier, he had underlined a single sentence twice. Developer advised to construct independent supply before neighborhood expansion. Recommendation acknowledged. No follow-up received. I leaned back in my chair and stared through the window toward the northern pasture. Suddenly, every strange conversation over the past several years made sense. Whenever I replaced pumps, residents complained about temporary pressure drops. Whenever I repaired underground lines, somebody from the subdivision called asking when their water would return. They had never asked who owned the system because they had assumed it belonged to some invisible public utility. Most of them probably had no idea their morning showers depended on equipment sitting inside an aging pump house surrounded by cattle fences. My thoughts were interrupted by another call from the county office. This time the voice belonged to a records supervisor who politely asked whether I could email copies of the original easement agreement, the annual maintenance permit, and the historical inspection records. She explained that several agencies were trying to determine exactly how the subdivision's water service had been documented. Over the years, I agreed immediately. Within 30 minutes I had scanned every relevant page and sent complete copies without removing a single document from its protective sleeve. My father believed originals belonged in safekeeping and copies belonged everywhere else. As the files uploaded, I noticed one final attachment tucked inside the oldest binder. It was a faded letter from the engineering firm that designed the temporary connection decades earlier. The final paragraph caught my attention immediately. It stated that operational authority over all valves, pumps, shutdown schedules, and maintenance procedures would remain exclusively with the ranch owner until formal transfer documents were executed and recorded with the county. I searched the remaining files for those transfer documents. They did not exist. There was no signed agreement, no recorded deed, no completed transfer, nothing. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pasture while the bright red valve beside the pump house reflected the light like a quiet signal waiting to be noticed. The same valve that generations of my family had maintained without complaint had become the center of a question nobody had bothered to ask until the water stopped flowing. And with every page I reviewed, one truth became impossible to ignore. The subdivision had spent years behaving as though ownership could be assumed, while every document resting on my kitchen table said exactly the opposite. By late afternoon, the ranch had become quieter than I had ever remembered. The pump house stood open while I finished replacing the worn seals, tightening every connection with the same heavy wrench my father had carried for years. Each turn of the steel handle echoed softly against the concrete walls before fading into the warm Texas air. The familiar smell of fresh lubricant mixed with sun-baked cedar and cool groundwater rising from the well shaft. Everything inside the building worked exactly as it was designed to work. The only difference was that, for the first time, people beyond my fence were finally noticing it existed. My email notification chimed just as I finished the final inspection. The County Records Office confirmed that every document I had submitted matched the archived files in their system. A second message arrived a few minutes later requesting digital copies of the original engineering correspondence because several departments were attempting to reconstruct the history of the temporary service connection. That single phrase caught my attention once again. Temporary service connection. It had appeared in nearly every document my father preserved, yet somewhere over the years people had simply stopped treating it as temporary. I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea while the evening breeze carried the smell of dry grass across the pasture. The bright red valve beside the pump house reflected the orange sunlight exactly the way it had when I was a boy. Dad used to rest one hand on that valve before every inspection and remind me that ownership was not proven by who depended on something. Ownership was proven by who accepted responsibility when it broke. Looking back, he had been preparing me for this moment without either of us realizing it. Just before sunset, another vehicle appeared at the entrance, but this time it was not Victoria. It was Daniel Brooks again. He stepped out holding a slim folder instead of a clipboard. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. He explained that county staff had compared my records with every available subdivision filing. There was no recorded transfer of the water infrastructure. There was no completed dedication to a public utility district. There was no document placing operational control anywhere except with the ranch. He chose his words carefully, making it clear that the county still needed to complete its review, but one sentence stood out above everything else. Mr. Walker, your maintenance shutdown appears to have been fully authorized from beginning to end. I thanked him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. We simply looked across the pasture toward the distant rooftops of Silver Creek Estates shimmering in the fading light. Somewhere beyond those houses, families were waiting for answers they had probably assumed someone else already had. Daniel closed the folder before returning to his truck. Tomorrow we'll answer a lot of questions, he said quietly. After he drove away, I walked back to the pump house one final time before sunset. The pressure gauge still rested at 0. The rebuilt pump waited silently beneath its steel housing. My maintenance checklist showed every task completed. All that remained was restarting the system at the scheduled time the following morning. I rested my hand on the smooth red valve and realized it had become more than painted steel. It had become the dividing line between assumptions and documented facts, and by sunrise, everyone on both sides of the fence would finally learn the difference. The first light of morning spread across the pasture in long golden bands as I unlocked the pump house for the final time. The air felt cooler than the day before, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth and limestone rising from the well. Every item on my maintenance checklist had been completed exactly as scheduled. The replacement seals were seated perfectly. The bearings turned without resistance. The electrical connections had been inspected twice. I ran my hand across the smooth steel housing of the old diesel pump before reaching the bright red valve that had quietly waited through an entire day of questions, accusations, and assumptions. My father always insisted that rushing the final inspection caused more problems than any mechanical failure ever could, so I moved slowly, checking each pressure gauge one last time. The glass face reflected the early sunlight while the needle rested calmly at 0, waiting for the system to come back to life. Just before I reached for the switch, 2 county vehicles rolled through my front gate. Daniel Brooks stepped out alongside another engineer from the utility district carrying a thick folder. They were not there to stop me. They were there to observe. Daniel smiled politely before explaining that several agencies wanted the restart documented because too many conflicting claims had surfaced during the previous 24 hours. I nodded and handed him a copy of my maintenance log. Every inspection time, every repair, every replacement part, and every scheduled procedure had been recorded down to the minute. The engineer quietly compared my paperwork with the documents inside her folder before giving a small nod of agreement. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been skipped. Everything matched the historical maintenance records already stored by the county. Outside the pump house, another line of vehicles appeared along the ranch road. This time they belonged to representatives from the subdivision, several county officials, and eventually Victoria herself. She stepped out looking far less confident than she had the afternoon before. Her eyes immediately settled on the red valve, then on the pressure gauges, and finally on the thick binders resting on my workbench. For the first time since we met, she did not begin by making demands. Instead, she asked one quiet question. When will the water return? Daniel answered before I could. He explained that the maintenance shutdown had been properly authorized, fully documented, and conducted entirely within the rights granted to the ranch owner under the recorded agreements still on file. Then he opened the engineering folder and pointed toward the original survey map. Every person standing inside that pump house leaned closer as he traced the blue pipeline from my family's well across the northern pasture and into Silver Creek Estates. The room became completely silent. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. The faded documents spoke with a confidence that no opinion could overcome. The temporary connection had never become permanent. Operational authority had never been transferred. Ownership had never changed. The assumptions that guided an entire neighborhood for years dissolved in the space of a few quiet minutes beside an old pressure gauge and a bright red valve. I finally reached toward the heavy steel switch and brought the pump back to life. The diesel engine settled into its familiar steady rhythm. The pressure gauge climbed smoothly upward, and somewhere beyond the northern fence line hundreds of faucets began flowing again. The water returned exactly as scheduled, but the story everyone believed about where it came from never would. The weeks that followed changed more than the water system. They changed the way everyone around Silver Creek Estates looked at the land beyond the northern fence. County engineers completed their review and confirmed what my father had documented decades earlier. The temporary service connection had remained exactly that, temporary, regardless of how many years had passed. The subdivision board quickly entered negotiations with the county utility district to construct an independent water supply instead of relying on assumptions that had quietly replaced paperwork. Until that project could be completed, a formal maintenance agreement was drafted, reviewed, and signed. For the first time, every responsibility was clearly defined on paper. Scheduled shutdowns required advance notice. Maintenance costs would be shared according to the agreement. Access to the pipeline would be coordinated through written requests instead of unexpected visits to my front porch. Everything my father had tried to encourage years earlier finally became reality because the truth had been placed beside the facts instead of hidden behind convenience. Victoria returned to the ranch one last time before construction began on the new infrastructure. She arrived without a folder full of subdivision policies and without the confidence that had accompanied our first conversation. We stood beside the old pump house while the diesel engine settled into its familiar steady rhythm and the pressure gauge held perfectly steady. She admitted that the neighborhood had accepted a story that nobody had ever bothered to verify. Somewhere between developers, management companies, and changing homeowners association boards, temporary had slowly become permanent in people's minds even though it never had on paper. She thanked me for maintaining the system all those years and apologized for assuming authority over something that had never belonged to the association. I accepted her apology because holding on to resentment would never improve a single pipe or refill a single reservoir. A few months later, excavation crews began installing a dedicated municipal water line along the county road north of my ranch. Every morning I watched new trenches stretch across the landscape, while heavy equipment replaced assumptions with infrastructure. The first day the independent system went online, I walked back into my family's pump house and listened to the familiar sounds that had shaped my childhood. The steady hum of the diesel engine, the quiet vibration beneath my boots, the soft clicking of the pressure gauge as it settled into place, the smell of clean groundwater rising through limestone. Nothing inside that building had changed, yet everything outside it had. The bright red valve remained exactly where my father painted it decades earlier, not as a symbol of control, but as a reminder that responsibility always begins where ownership does. Before locking the pump house for the evening, I rested my hand on the old steel handle one last time and thought about the lesson my grandfather passed to my father and my father passed to me. Land can be shared. Water can be supplied. Good neighbors can work together. But none of those things should ever depend on assumptions replacing honest agreements. The strongest foundation in any community is not concrete, steel, or buried pipelines. It is respect for the truth that has already been written down. I never took anything away from that neighborhood. I simply followed the maintenance schedule my family had honored for generations. And in doing so, I uncovered a story that had been waiting quietly beneath the ground all along. Justice never arrived with shouting or sirens. It arrived with old maps, careful records, a pressure gauge that never lied, and one bright red valve that patiently reminded everyone where responsibility had always begun.